Lesson 6.1 is about theoretical versus experimental probabilities. So theoretical probability is what should happen. So if you look at the odds, what should happen? This is defined as the ratio of the number of favorable outcomes, meaning where you get what you want, to the total number of outcomes. So for example, if you're doing an experiment, experiment's a strong word, it's not really quite an experiment if you're flipping a coin. But your sample space, basically your option is you can get heads or tails. The number of outcomes is 2. And the probability of getting heads is 1/2 or 0.5 or 50%. Usually we'll do a fraction or a percentage, but it's not a big deal. If we were asked for the number of heads, the number of times you get heads, that would be 1. So n is the number of outcomes. And p, so n is, n for number. P, probability of something, is the number of outcomes over total number of outcomes. So if you have your n, or your number, to turn it into a probability, divide it by your total. For the second example, let's say you roll a die. Again, not really what I would call an experiment, but we're calling it that. You roll a die. Your sample space is, well, if you roll a die, a standard one, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. Your total number of outcomes is 6. The probability of getting a 4 is 1 out of 6. The probability of getting an even number, well, 2, 4, and 6 are even, so 3 out of 6, or 1/2. Now we have a slightly more interesting so-called experiment. We're going to pick a card at random from a standard deck of 52 cards. So probability of getting a black, well, there's 13 in each row because there's 10 numbers and Jack, Queen, and King. So there's 13 in each row. So the probability of getting black is 13 plus 6 is 13, which is 26 over 52, which simplifies to 1/2. Probability of getting a queen, well, there's 4 queens in a standard deck. So that's 4 out of 52, which simplifies to 1 out of 13. Probability of getting hearts, it's basically a quarter, but we have 13 out of 52, which simplifies to a 4th. It's good to end up with simplified answer. Okay, so you can use this picture when you're doing the homework, which I would actually call classwork. So I would work on it, during a normal time. Don't just leave it for later and forget to do it. Experimental probability. This is what actually happens. So for theoretical probability, if you pick a card, every other time you should get red, then black, then red, then black. And 1 in every 13 times you should get a queen. And every fourth time you should get a heart. But obviously that doesn't necessarily happen. That's just the big picture probability. But what actually happens is your experimental probability. So the ratio of the number of times a favorable event actually occurs to the number, to the total number of times the experiment occurs. So let's say we're looking at probability of getting a black. Let's say you draw a card 5 times. You should get a black card half the time, but what actually happens? That's what we're talking about with experimental probability. So theoretical is what should happen when you look at the odds, and experimental is what actually happens when you perform the experiment.